Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Ute Dash. I am one of your hosts, Sammy Mora, and today I'm joined by Cole Bagley, as always, my wonderful co-host. But we have a special guest today, joining us from the Daily Universe at BYU, Caleb Turner. Caleb, how are you today?
Yo, 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 what's up, guys? Doing all right. Yeah, holding it down here in Provo.
For sure. Cole, how are you today?
Well, we've got a victim on our show today, so I'm pretty excited for it.
So, the three of us were talking Holy War. What would have happened? We all know, Holy War was canceled this year, sadly, due to COVID-19. But it's got us thinking: is the talent gap really real between Utah and BYU? Cole, do you want to take the first point?
The talent. Let me start. There's a reason that BYU has not beat Utah for the last 10 years. And that's because there is and has been a better recruiting job by the University of Utah. They've been able to get better talent to develop that talent better than BYU has. And so there is a talent gap. At least there has been for the last decade.
Totally. And there's about 4 positions that we think that the biggest talent gaps are. Caleb, do you want to talk about wide receiver with between the two schools?
Yeah, for sure. Just before I delve into one position, though, I think it's more of a recruiting gap more than anything. The one thing we're going to go into this more, but the one thing this year's BYU team has going for them, and all successful BYU teams have, is experience and chemistry, and the ability to grow a team over multiple years, because we don't have the 5-star recruits, 4-star recruits like Utah has. So that's something that we have going for us this year. And when that can happen, good things happen. Unfortunately, wide receiver is not one of those positions this year that we have a lot of experience, especially if you include tight end Matt Bushman, who went down. He was our leading receiver as a tight end the past 3 years in a row, and he ruptured his Achilles a couple weeks ago. So we are now led by a group of a couple juniors and a senior at wide receiver. The biggest name being Gunnar Romney. He's a junior. He had a pretty solid first game at Navy. But it's a young group, pretty inexperienced, because we lost a bunch of really, really good senior receivers last year.
For sure. And I think Utah, on the other hand, Utah is full of experience. They're full of talent, and they're full of depth at that wide receiver position. Just to name a couple, you have Solomon Enos, you have Britton Covey, who grew up a BYU fan but never got that BYU offer, and then brought his talents to Utah, and now is one of the best we've had. Then you have Brian Thompson, you have Samson Nakua, who's also from Utah County. His brother played at BYU also, and he didn't get that BYU offer, and he decided to come to Utah. I think Utah wins this one in the wide receiver category, hands down.
Yeah, I got to agree with Caleb here. I think it is a big recruitment difference. When you're looking at especially the wide receivers, Britton Covey was a guy that was unwanted by BYU, and 2 seasons ago in 2018, this is a guy unwanted. He comes to Utah, and despite his small size, he was one of our biggest targets, if not the biggest, in 2018. He was targeted 60 times. He averaged 10.6 yards in a reception, and he went for over 637 yards. And so when you look at the recruitment, to me, if you're a local kid growing up in Utah, the religion has somewhat to do with it. BYU being a religious school, they do attract a lot of Latter-day Saint members to their school. However, when you look at it, you look at the two schools. Let's say you have an offer from both. If you have an offer from both schools, which one do you want to go to? Do you want to go to a school that's in a Power 5 conference that's going to get you a lot more, give you an opportunity to play against better talent, usually, unless, BYU with their independent program has been able to play against some pretty good schools and some top talent. What's funny is they actually play a lot of Pac-12 schools, but they've played some schools in the SEC. But ultimately, you're going to have a great opportunity if you're going to Utah, in my opinion, more so than at BYU, who occasionally is filling their scheduling with a lot of lower rate teams opposed to a hefty Pac-12 schedule.
Mhm.
Are you referring to this season or every season?
Oh, just the last couple seasons.
Okay.
So Caleb already kind of touched on it, but with the tight end position, this one was one that I think there's less of a gap between the two schools. I am the biggest Brant Keefe fan on the planet. I love him. Fantastic tight end. Probably going to be a draft pick either this year or next year. But I like Matt Bushman as well. I think that he's probably the third best tight end in the state. Cole Fotheringham is probably that number 2. But again, I think Utah just barely edges out BYU in the tight end position for me.
Well, especially now that Bushman's injured. Our 2 tight ends, I think we've got like a junior, I don't even know his name, and then a freshman, Isaac Rex, who is the backup to Matt Bushman before he got injured. So as of right now, there's really no comparison. But yeah, if you're including Bushman, if he would have played in that season opener against Utah, I think it's pretty close.
Yeah, just to compare the two, so we're just taking the best season from both, which actually happened to be last year. Bushman, 47 receptions, 688 yards. He averaged 14.6 yards in a reception, 4 touchdowns. Now, Keefe, 34 receptions, 602 yards. So he averaged a little bit more at 17.7 and 6 touchdowns. I do think it's really, really close. Bushman has been described as just an ogre. He's a little bit bigger than Keefe, I think about 3 or 4 inches bigger. But to me, that shows how good Keefe is to be able to keep up with someone like Bushman. And it's very close. But if I had to pick between the two, I'd probably go for Keefe. But with that being said, if you had someone other than Zach Wilson passing to Bushman, if he was wearing maybe a Utah uniform, maybe you're taking Bushman over Keefe.
Woohoo! First shot fired. All right.
So speaking of Zach Wilson and quarterbacks, let's move over to Utah. I'll let Caleb take the first shots with this one.
At QB?
Yeah.
So I did let you guys know ahead of time that I have not done as much research as I probably should have on the Utah roster on your guys' team. However, while we might not have the top talent at QB, we have the depth. Because as you guys know, we have Zach Wilson, who's the starter, but right behind him is Baylor Romney, Gunner's brother. They've got that brother connection. It works out. And then we've got Jaron Hall, who's like the dual threat. He can run it type thing. They all 3 started games last year. And actually the backups had a better record wins wise than Zach Wilson had. And I know there's been a lot of talk going around, especially preseason, of people outside of BYU saying, hey, is Zach Wilson actually the guy? Is he the best quarterback at BYU? And, I think that's still yet to be seen. I don't think I think he has a lot left to write in his legacy, hopefully. But based on the first game against Navy, had a solid game, over 100 yards passing, a couple of touchdowns as well. So he didn't quite get to show everything there, but I would put Zach Wilson up against anybody, honestly.
And then Utah on the opposite side, we don't know who would have been the starting quarterback at the Holy War if it would have happened. Would it have been Jake Bentley? Would it have been Cam Rising? Both quarterbacks, me and Cole have talked about who would have been the starting quarterback at Utah multiple times, but Bentley, I think, still edges out Wilson, not just because Bentley has more college experience and played in the SEC and had all of these big time moments where he came in clutch. But I just like the fact that we would have a quarterback who's made it through a season, because Zach has been banged up quite a lot in his short time at BYU already. And yes, Bentley's season got cut short last year at South Carolina, but he's been relatively healthy for most of his time.
Well, I'm about to throw a little more heat your way, Caleb. Before I do so, we encourage you guys to throw us some heat in the comments, in the chat, ask us questions. We love when our viewers are engaging. So please, feel free. But Caleb, my favorite stat of Zach Wilson is that he has thrown more touchdown passes to Utah players in his career in the Holy War than his own teammates. He's thrown 3 pick sixes to 2 touchdown passes. So I think he's forgetting. I mean, he was raised a Utah fan, so I can understand that appeal to throw to a guy in red. But just I love statistics, and I'm just going to throw some more stats out there just to compare the two quarterbacks. So again, doing best seasons, Wilson was definitely last year. He played the whole year for the most part. His completion percentage was 62.4. He threw for 2,382 yards, so 7.5 average, 11 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. I think one of Wilson's his weaknesses is I think he's not as aggressive as he should be in the right moments, and I think the moments that he shouldn't be aggressive, he is. He throws a lot of interceptions. I mean, it's almost 1 for 1. I mean, he threw two more touchdown passes than he did interceptions. But comparing that to Bentley, who all we've got is his South Carolina stats. He hasn't played yet for the U. His best season was in 2018, 61.9 completion percentage, so a little bit lower than Zach's. But he did throw for over 3,000 yards, 8.2 average, 27 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. I think that experience and that play in the SEC is where Bentley has Zach. I think that Bentley is just a better quarterback. Now, he is a senior compared to Wilson's a junior. Is that correct, Caleb?
Yeah.
So just a little bit more experience that usually makes players better.
For sure. So we've broken down some of the roster, some of the key offensive positions, but what really would have happened if these two would have met at Rice-Eccles Stadium first Thursday in September? What do we think happens? Does Utah extend the streak to 10, which would have been the longest streak for either team? Do you guys think that Utah would have extended this? Cole, we'll jump to you.
Utah continues the streak. If they were to play, I think it would be a close one because that's just how these games are. It doesn't matter. That's what makes the Holy War so special. It doesn't matter if one of the teams is ranked in the top 25, even the top 15 or top 10, and the other one isn't. It's just it's the rivalry, and it's what makes it so special. And we've talked about that before, but Utah's offense is far superior to BYU's, especially with Bushman going down. Now, I do think BYU's defense, I think that's where they're a little bit better than Utah, especially with all the players Utah lost in the draft this last year. Despite that, turnovers would be the name of the game for me. And as we know, Wilson likes to make some bad decisions. He lets that pressure get to him. I think our defense would be able to get those turnovers coming from the BYU side. And within probably a possession, I think Utah would have kept that streak going and pushed it to 10.
Yeah, so Cole mentioned it'd be a close game. Hard to disagree with that. I think it'd also be close, as they always are. And another common theme from these games, the Holy War games, seems to be turnovers, which you also mentioned. And I think that has to do with the emotions that they come with this game, right? A lot of times the players let the emotions get the best of them and they lose the mental aspect of the game, and that's when mistakes come in. However, and I think that's a big reason that BYU has lost in the past, especially the past few years with a younger team. They haven't known what to do with those emotions, whereas Utah has allowed those emotions to drive them, to be more aggressive, to make the play. On BYU's side, the emotions have made them make mistakes or slip up or forget about things and get a little too passionate but use it the wrong way. However, I think that's where things would have changed this year with what I mentioned was a much more experienced team. I think, with Zach Wilson being a junior, with having that experienced defense as well, we've got Isaiah Kafusi, a senior, a linebacker leading the defense, Kairos Tonga as well on the defensive line. I think that veteran experience would have taken over and they wouldn't have allowed the emotions to affect them as negatively as they have in the past couple of years.
I think it would have been a really close game also, but here's the thing that I think this game would have been solved. Like turnovers and emotions factored in as well. This game would have been won in the trenches. I want to see how a relatively younger Utah offensive line would have stacked up against that BYU defensive line. You already mentioned Kairos Tonga. He's a madman. Like, he can get in there. He was destroying Navy's offensive line the last time that you guys played on Labor Day. I think that would have been won in the trenches on both sides. I also want to see how a relatively younger Utah defensive line would have went up against this prized offensive line that BYU has. That offensive line is legit at BYU. I'm not like diminishing the fact that ours is also legit, but theirs is, that's a good offensive line. Zach doesn't look like he's taking that much pressure, but I would have loved to see how Utah's defensive linemen reacted, because a couple of the guys on that line have played in this game before. Mika Tafua, Max Tupai, those guys have played in this game, so they know what's on the line. And I'm pretty sure they would tell the other guys and get them in that position. But this game would have been won in the trenches. Which quarterback is under the most pressure? Because when you're making those throws under pressure, you're more likely to throw those interceptions that we talked about.
It would be interesting to see, if Bentley was taking the snaps, how Bentley would come into this game. Would he feel some of that pressure? Would he kind of come into it and say, I'm the outside guy, I'm a little nervous to play in this game I've never experienced? Or would he come into it as, this is just another game for me? For him, BYU is not an opponent I don't think he's ever played. And he hasn't had a whole lot of exposure, to them. So it would be interesting. And I think the X factor would be Bentley, to see, can he take this onslaught of wide receivers and tight ends and really just take advantage and tip the scale in Utah's favor and beat that oiled machine defense that BYU has. I mean, BYU does have a fantastic defense. Caleb, you mentioned a couple of players. Isaiah Kafusi, I actually went to high school with that guy. What's funny is he played wide receiver in high school, and they've just beefed him up. He's put on a lot of weight, and he is fantastic. I think he's a guy that could be an NFL prospect. And so those are probably the two X factors for me. Is, does Bentley take control of the Utah offense, or does Isaiah Kafusi in his senior year finally get that W against Utah, that very coveted W? But another interesting thing is that you have to, if we're talking hypothetical here, let's say Rice Eccles is sold out. You've got a full-on sea of red in those stands. BYU has not beaten Utah at Utah since 2006, the famous Beck to Harleen. That's back when I was wearing blue. That's a game that my dad and I, were watching, and I was cheering against Utah. Now I've since come to my senses. But Caleb, what do you think it would take for BYU to come into Rice Eccles and 14 years later to get a W, realistically?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's tough, obviously. I mean, there's a reason it's been 10 years, right? Well, and it's been even longer, you mentioned, at Rice Eccles. And I think it really, really has to do with that that capacity and just mental ability to control the emotions. Honestly, that seems like what's been the biggest factor for me. I think it was the game a couple of years ago. BYU went up by a couple touchdowns, second half, early in the third quarter, leading by a couple touchdowns at halftime, right? And it seemed like they were using those emotions to come out and be aggressive, like you mentioned. And I don't know what the answer is to maintain that aggressive nature, but also at the same time avoid those mistakes, right? Because it seems like for BYU, it kind of goes hand in hand. When we're aggressive, we have turnovers, right? And so I think that's where, that ability to just control those emotions. And I think being consistent. We couldn't even be consistent for a whole game 2 years ago, right? We were one team in the first half, a different team in the second half. So consistency from quarter to quarter and from year to year is really what it's going to take. The past couple of years for BYU have been maddening for fans because we look amazing against teams like USC, like Tennessee, like Wisconsin, right? And then we turn around and we lose to Utah, right? Like, who loses to Utah? I don't know.
Most of the Pac-12 South, but I'm just
yes. The lauded Pac-12 South. I like it. So yeah, I mean, consistency, and then I'm not going to use it as an excuse necessarily, but injuries have played a large factor in BYU's seasons recently, and unfortunately this season as well with Matt Bushman. our offensive coordinator, Jeff Grimes, he said that in all of his years of coaching, I think he's been a coach for 20 plus years. He said he's never seen a year of injuries as bad as BYU had last year. So I think it's going to take consistency and being healthy. And like I said from the start, being able to grow from year to year with a veteran team in order for us to beat Utah.
Yeah, I agree. I think injuries has been one of the biggest things that has consistently plagued BYU, especially last year. Last year was hard because at one point, weren't you guys down to like your fourth string quarterback at some point during the season? Yeah. See, that's insane that the injury bug bit BYU so bad that they were playing their fourth string quarterback. I think if they have a healthy BYU team, I don't ever want to see BYU beat Utah in my lifetime, but if I had to see it, I think BYU needs to be a healthy team. They need to be focused, like you already mentioned, is like that game is probably, depending on the schedule for BYU, that could be their biggest game of the season. Like they always talk about the rivalry games, which for BYU is like Utah, Utah State, Boise State. Those are their games. And I think they let their emotions get the better of them in most of those games. The Boise State BYU game is always a low scoring and messy game. Like you never know what's going to happen. Usually like one year, I think the final score was like 7-6. That if that's not like a game, like is it a defensive game? Was it just a messy game? What was it? They need to stay focused, but I don't see BYU beating Utah for the next couple of years. Until BYU also can get into a P5 conference and be able to get to the level of recruiting that Utah's at, I don't see it happening. Utah and BYU go after a lot of the same kids locally here in state, but at the same time, Utah is able to take these 3-star prospects and turn them into NFL stars. BYU seems to do it occasionally, but not all the time. And I think if they can get to the same level on the recruiting scale that Utah's on, or even just a little bit better, they have a better chance of beating Utah.
Yeah, I've got my take on this subject, but I want to ask Caleb a question. Caleb, what impact do you think being an independent team has had, not only on the rivalry itself, but the quality of your recruits and being able to put together really, really good teams? Because I mean, this rivalry has gone back and forth. I mean, during the 80s and 90s, it was swapped. I mean, BYU just owned Utah, and now it's switched again. Do you think being independent has had much of an impact on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to say it hasn't. Just to give a little bit of context from my point of view, though. So my parents both went to Utah State, so I did not grow up a BYU fan or a Utah fan, or honestly, they weren't even really big Aggie fans either. I came to BYU for the first time in 2013, and that is when I actually started following the team. So we were already independent at that point. We had already started losing to you guys at that point. So I've only ever known BYU losses. Unfortunately, it's been a tough lifetime of a fan for me. But yeah, I mean, I think if nothing else, recruiting is one thing, I think, but just from like a mentality standpoint, I feel like when you're part of a conference, you have this idea that you're part of something bigger, right? You're part of something with a reputation, with a certain level of competition. Whereas being an independent, it's like you're the underdog all the time. And so, to play year after year as an underdog, to play year after year, like you're just fighting for that next win, and you don't really have a lot of that maybe like support around you, or like a conference, frankly. I'm sure it can be tough mentally for BYU to always be, scrapping like that, right? And trying to find, I mean, this year, as good as any other year, is an example of what it's like to be an independent, because we lost all of our games because they were canceled due to COVID, and we were not affiliated with anything else. So we had to literally scrap a schedule together from other teams that were willing to play us. And for once, we're not so much an underdog because we're playing a lot of the underdog teams. But I think it definitely, especially from like a mental standpoint, I feel like it can definitely have an effect.
Yeah, no, I like what you said there. And being independent for BYU, I think it has its benefits. I mean, you guys are able to play on ESPN a lot, which is great exposure. And another thing too is you guys are able to play a lot of pretty high level teams. I mean, you played USC last year and you beat them. You played Tennessee. You went into Tennessee and you beat those guys. And that is one thing that's very respectable about BYU being independent is I think very similarly to Utah, is a lot of times they do play to they rise to the occasion. They play to the level of their opponent. There's very rarely is BYU being just absolutely blown out in a game. Even the games that they lose are usually relatively close. But what I think the issue is with the Holy War is what's going to make the difference, what's going to break the streak is BYU has got to remove the psychological restraints that the Holy War, I think, has placed on them. Utah sees BYU as this insignificant little brother to the south that they beat up. They don't have to worry about it. They don't have to look over their shoulder and see what's going on. BYU comes around, they smack them around a little bit and throw them back down south. And there is a different feel to these games, but clearly Utah has been able to execute, kind of what you've talked about earlier. Utah has been able to execute. Now, something interesting to me is while Utah fans at times can be cocky about the rivalry, I mean, we have won 9 straight. BYU has lost to Utah BYU has lost to Utah, like I said, 9 straight times. Of those 9 losses, 8 have been decided by a single possession. Mm-hmm. So it's not like BYU is just trying to slay this giant dragon. It's right there. I mean, like you were mentioning, 2 years ago, Utah is down 20-0 at half and then down 27-7. And they rally in the fourth quarter and they win 35-27. And I think it was either a year or two before that, Taysom Hill goes for the 2-point conversion to win the game, doesn't get it. And then in, I believe, 2013, BYU had 2 attempts to kick a field goal for the win, and it doesn't happen. And so it's right there, but they've got, to me, it's just psychological and a little bit of talent. But I think mostly psychological.
I also think with them joining a conference would solve a lot of these issues. Like Caleb mentioned, being a part of a conference is being a part of something that's bigger. The reason why Utah sees BYU as a little brother is because we're more focused on going for a Pac-12 championship. We're focused on the bigger fish to fry. Until BYU can get in a conference, they're not going to be in that mentality. They're in that mentality still of, oh, we've got to beat Utah because beating Utah makes a season for us. Because they don't have those hopes of postseason. They can go bowling, but their chances of making the college football playoff are slim to none unless they have a freaking loaded schedule, which probably won't happen. If they can just get into a conference, that will help break down some of these psychological barriers that they've built up for themselves. Because at the end of the day, Utah is playing for something bigger. And if BYU could be able to be like, oh, we're playing for something bigger too, this is just another game, I think that they would have a better shot at winning.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big factor here as far as the importance that BYU fans place on this game is just like the nostalgia factor. I think Cole mentioned it. A lot of our fans are like middle-aged, right? They were young back in the 80s and 90s with those really, really good BYU teams, and they're so used to BYU being so good, and they have that idea, a lot of times an unrealistic idea, right, of this BYU team. And so I think that's why it's just such a big deal for so many people. Every single year, there's like these polls that go out from BYU fans and stuff, and it's like, would you rather like go undefeated or would you rather beat Utah? And like a lot of times they would rather beat Utah than go undefeated. It's just like, it's such a big thing, like Cole mentioned, psychologically. And I think that gets to the players as well. And I would agree, because they have been such close games, I think you can really point to the mental aspect rather than the talent gap and say, okay, if they had just made that field goal, okay, if they had just not thrown that interception, the games could be a lot different. So I think that's really where the key lies, is in avoiding those errors and just making sure you're taking care of business. Just a business trip, right?
For sure. So that's all the time we have for today. We just want to thank Caleb once again for coming on the show, talking about Holy War with us. We really appreciate it. But before we go, we're doing columns now, exclusively published with Sports Pac-12. You can follow them on Twitter at Pac-12 Sport or at Sports Pac-12, and check out their website at sportspac12.com. Also, all of the columns are going to be linked on our website at -sports.tv. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at -sports.tv. We'll see you guys next week. And as always, go Utes!
Go Utes!